Hey guys, and welcome to another video on this channel. In this video I wanted to experiment with the cheapest oil paint I could find versus the professional artist quality real deal. I'll be painting the same image to keep all them variables the same. For my budget choice, I'll be using the most inexpensive oil paints I could find at a budget store versus a Winsor Newton oil colours. I'm going to share the full process from the start and talk through my experience in using both mediums. With this painting, the left side with the brown tone shown will be the cheap paints versus the right side in Winsor Newton. Now the image I painted was one that I'd taken in the woodlands, where I'd taken the image and reverse flipped it from left to right, and here we get to play with some really cool symmetry, which will really help to draw out a close comparison. Now for the surface of my painting, I'm going to be preparing a heavy watercolour paper in none other than the Winsor Newton White Gesso Primer. And this is an essential step in the process, as oil paint would just soak into the paper without a non-absorbent barrier, and we really want that oil paint to sit nicely on the surface so that we can work it around with a lot more ease. And finally, I should mention that I'll be using the exact same colour matches for all of the paints. So I'll use a budget phthalo blue and a Winsor Newton phthalo blue, as to really not create any bias within this experiment. So let's begin our initial sketch to help us draw a good fair comparison. And as you can see, I have separated the paper into two sides, and here I'm really going to try my best to paint within the lines with the designated brand of paint. Here I'm adding a thin wash of burnt sienna to begin the underpainting. And as I've moved to the left side, I've switched to the budget colour, and at this initial stage there seems to be no real difference here. So now let's really squeeze some paint out and use a lot more of that budget paint to begin with. Now my first impression of these cheap paints was just how much oil had been added and that was actually just coming out of the tubes. Now this was probably them using less actual pigment, or just a thing that gives us that strong colour. It was incredibly watered or oiled down, shall I say. And because of this, my initial inclination was to paint quite loosely, as I couldn't be very detailed with the paint being like this. So now I'm adding hints of blue, but I'm still very much in the underpainting stage. So let's take a closer look and begin with our trusted Winsor Newton paints. Immediately the difference noted was the paint being much drier. This might sound bad, but actually this is good because I can still choose if I want to add more oil, unlike the cheap paint set. I naturally found, having years of painting experience, somehow I had so much more control over the paint. Maybe it was due to being able to control the viscosity of the paint, and with the Winsor and Newton paints, this was something where I had a choice, whereas with the cheap paint set, I felt like I was painting with butter. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, however with the cheap paints, I was limited to using an excessive amount of oil, which made it very tricky to spend long durations working on fine detail. Another disadvantage was the drying time that this had created. Now let me tell you that I literally waited a whole week for the budget paints to dry, which was not ideal in making this video or simply just wanting to make more progress on my painting. What I will say is that I was still quite impressed with what I had achieved with the budget set. It just felt like I somehow had to work much harder, making it almost less enjoyable. And with the underpainting wrapped up, let's get some colour on with our professional grade Winsor Newton paints. Now I try to see the best of a lower quality option. Maybe on the left side with the budget paints I had some more dynamic textures. Maybe even I was more free with them, creating a fresher look. As an artist, from my point of view, just maybe I was more careful and diligent with the Winsor Newton paints. But again, is this a good or bad thing? Let me know in the comments what you guys think. So here I'm starting to paint much tighter with the professional paints, and honestly this was so much easier. And this really made me realise I really had my work cut out for me when I was going to try and reattempt this with those cheaper paints. With the Winsor and Newton paints, the experience of mixing my values or light and dark colours was so much easier. So now let's give our budget paints my best shot. And immediately I was faced with the challenge of having to work with a much more oilier medium. This in fact took me longer and forced me to slow down my usual working speed. I began using yellow ochre straight from the tube as I found it less painful to mix. This also became the case with most of the colours in the budget set, as my surface was getting more and more sticky with oil. So I knew now my new tactic was to have to work in many layers on this left side, which I kind of didn't want to do because of how long I would have to wait for each layer to dry. But with that being said, let's persevere and try to make the most of a tricky medium. These budget paints again were the cheapest I could find at £3.50 for a full set of the basic colours plus even a few extras. So here I had the second layer achieved and dry on both sides, and now it was time to redefine some of them problem areas I had first encountered with those cheaper paints. As far as £3.50 goes, that would probably get you one 37ml tube of professional grade Winsor Newton paint. And let me tell you now that this investment is definitely worth it, because I feel like anything budget paints could do, Winsor & Newton paints can simply do better, while being more adaptable to modification. And it was starting to show later on in this process some of the technical advantages of using a better medium. As we can see on the right hand side, I had managed to achieve some finer control of my paint handling. This is by no means to create some sort of endorsement for a particular brand of paint, but rather an honest experience in comparing the cheap brands with the professional. So now let's look at our final touches and review my best attempt at comparing two mediums closely together. Here, as you can see, I revisited that left side with the cheap paints and tried to add even more layers and colour. What I will say is that with further effort, I feel the left side really stood out now. And here we are starting to see some more interesting textures on the left trunk. So guys, please let me know which one you prefer in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching, please subscribe to help me create more videos just like this. Thank you.